There is a category of evil that the 19th century had no adequate framework for identifying until it had already run its course. The criminal sciences that would eventually produce the vocabulary, the clinical terminology, the behavioral typologies, the systematic methods of connecting a pattern of deaths to a single source, were in their infancy in 1884, and they had not yet reached the rural counties of West Virginia in any practical sense. In a remote community with no physician on hand and no forensic capacity of any kind, there was almost nothing a person could do with a suspicion except carry it in silence and watch what happened next. This is the condition that the Holloway sisters understood and exploited with a patience and a thoroughness that the official record of Nicholas County, West Virginia can still not entirely account for. Their names were Dorotha and Lena Holloway. Dorotha was 38 years old in 1884. Lena was 35. They were the daughters of a farming family from the Muddlety Creek area of Nicholas County, a community so remote that the term remote, applied to the general condition of rural West Virginia in this period, requires a further degree of qualification. Muddlety Creek ran through a hollow in the eastern section of the county, where the nearest road of any quality was several miles distant, where the nearest physician was in Summersville, which was a day's hard travel away, and where the institutions that might elsewhere provide some check on what a person chose to do inside their own household, church, community assembly, law, were present more in name than in practice. People in that hollow knew each other, they watched each other, but watching and understanding are different things, and the distance between a neighbor's house and your own, measured in steep terrain and narrow creek crossings, was wide enough that a great deal could happen without witnesses. Drop your location in the comments before we continue, because the events that unfolded in that hollow between 1878 and 1884 did so in full view of a community that saw enough to be uncomfortable and not enough to be certain. And the line between those two conditions is where the Holloway sisters lived for 6 years. Their parents, a man named Harlan Holloway and his wife Mina, had settled on their Muddlety Creek property in the 1850s and raised 5 children to adulthood, of whom Dorotha and Lena were the 2 youngest. The older 3 had moved away from the hollow by the time the events of this account began. 1 son to the coal fields, 1 daughter to marriage in a distant county, 1 daughter whose whereabouts after 1875 the record does not clearly establish. Dorotha had married a man named Clement Prater in 1869 and remained on the hollow, on a property adjacent to her parents' land. Lena had never married and lived with her parents in the family house. By 1878, Harlan Holloway was 71 years old and in declining health. Mina Holloway was 68 and in better condition than her husband, though not strong. The care of both parents had fallen, in the way that such arrangements fell in that era and that geography, to the daughters who remained. Dorotha managed both her own household and the increasing demands of her parents' care. Lena lived in the house and attended to the daily requirements. In the spring of 1878, Harlan Holloway died. The death was attributed by community understanding to his long declining health and his age. There was no physician present. There was no formal record of the cause of death beyond what was written in the community church register by the circuit preacher who visited Muddlety Creek 4 times a year and who recorded Harlan's death as natural. The funeral was attended by the community, as funerals in that hollow were. Several people who were present recalled in statements given years later that both Dorotha and Lena had seemed, during the service, less grief-stricken than the occasion warranted. The word that appeared in more than one of those later accounts was not one the speakers were comfortable applying. One woman, a neighbor named Ivy Skidmore, described it as a brightness in their faces that did not belong there. She said she had noticed it and had told herself she was wrong to notice it, because what she was seeing could not be what she thought she was seeing. She told herself she was wrong. She moved on, and Mina Holloway remained alive and in her daughter's care for another 3 years, during which time she became progressively more ill in a manner that her neighbors and the circuit preacher attributed to the gradual decline of a woman in her 70s who had lost her husband and was losing her strength. Mina Holloway died in the winter of 1881. The circuit preacher recorded the death as natural. He noted that her daughters had cared for her devotedly throughout her illness and that they bore their loss with Christian fortitude. At the funeral, Ivy Skidmore saw the brightness again. Clement Prater, Dorotha's husband, was the next to die. He was 44 years old. He had been, by every account available, a healthy man with no significant prior illness. He became sick in the autumn of 1882 and was dead by the following spring. The circuit preacher recorded his death as resulting from a stomach ailment of progressive severity. There was no physician. There was no examination. There was a community of neighbors who attended the funeral and who, in varying degrees of consciousness, noticed the expression on Dorotha Holloway Prater's face and filed it somewhere in their minds next to the expression they had observed at the funerals of Harlan and Mina Holloway, and said nothing. By the spring of 1883, Dorotha was a widow. She had inherited the Prater property and, through the management of her parents' estate, a share of the Holloway family land. She and Lena continued to live as they had lived, the two of them adjacent households on the same stretch of hollow, managing their properties and their lives with the same quiet efficiency that the community had always observed in them and had never quite known what to make of. The death that finally broke the silence was not another family member. It was a child, a girl named Bess Fulton, 9 years old, the daughter of a farming family whose property was the closest neighboring land to the Holloway parcels, died in September of 1883. She had spent the week before her death in and around the Holloway properties, as children in that hollow sometimes did, moving between neighboring households as the work and the season and adult permission allowed. She became ill suddenly, in a manner her parents described to the circuit preacher as resembling no illness they had seen before. She was dead within 4 days. Her father, a man named George Fulton, did not attend the Fulton girl's funeral quietly, he said, to anyone who would listen in the days immediately following his daughter's death, that he believed his daughter had been given something. He did not have the word for what he meant. The vocabulary of poisoning, of deliberate administration of a toxic substance, was not available to him in any form that would have been legible in an official proceeding. He said given something. The community understood what he meant. They had been accumulating understanding for 5 years, and the death of Bess Fulton was the weight that finally exceeded the structure's capacity. A man named Felix Dunbar, who served as a sort of informal community authority in the Muddletee Creek area, a literate man who handled correspondence and legal documents for neighbors who needed such things managed, wrote a letter to the Nicholas County Sheriff in the autumn of 1883. The letter, which is preserved in the Nicholas County Circuit Court records in Somersville, is a careful document written by a man who understood that what he was alleging was serious and that his credibility depended on precision. He did not accuse directly. He laid out the sequence of deaths: Harlan Holloway, Mina Holloway, Clement Prater, Bess Fulton, with dates and the names of community members who could speak to each. He noted the pattern, he noted the expressions at the funerals. He asked the sheriff to come. The Nicholas County Sheriff in 1883 was a man named Ira Samples. He was not a man who had investigated anything resembling this before, and the tools available to him were limited. But he came to Muddletee Creek. He arrived in the late autumn of 1883, and he spoke to the community, and he spoke to Dorotha and Lena Holloway directly. Dorotha Holloway Prater was described by Samples in his case notes, notes that were later included in the Nicholas County Circuit Court file opened in the spring of 1884, as a composed and articulate woman who answered his questions without visible discomfort. She expressed appropriate grief for the deaths he asked about. She provided for each one an explanation consistent with the official record: her father's age and infirmity, her mother's decline, her husband's stomach ailment, the Fulton girl's sudden illness, which she described as a tragedy and nothing more. She was, Samples wrote, the most difficult witness he had ever attempted to read. He wrote that he had no purchase on her. He wrote that she seemed to understand, throughout their conversation, exactly what he was and was not capable of proving, and that her responses were calibrated accordingly. Lena Holloway was different. Samples described her as quieter than her sister, less controlled in her presentation, with a quality to her stillness that he found harder to sit with than Dorotha's composure. He noted that Lena did not meet his eyes consistently, not in the way of a person who is guilty and afraid, but in the way of a person whose attention is partly elsewhere. He wrote that at one point during their conversation, Lena had smiled. He wrote that the smile was not directed at him and was not in response to anything said. He wrote that it arrived and departed in a moment, and that Dorotha had glanced at her sister when it appeared, a glance Samples described as a signal of some kind between them, the nature of which he could not determine. Samples returned to Somersville and opened a formal inquiry. The inquiry focused on obtaining whatever physical evidence remained, which, given the time elapsed since the deaths and the absence of any preserved remains, was almost nothing. He was able to exhume the remains of Clement Prater, whose grave was the most recent and whose body was the most likely to yield information. He brought the only physician available, a man named Dr. Solomon Webb from Somersville, to examine what was recovered. Dr. Webb's findings, filed with the court in March of 1884, are the most significant document in this case. Webb was working without the benefit of the systematic toxicological methods that would become standard later in the century, but he was an observant physician, and he recorded what he observed with precision. He recorded that the state of the remains was consistent with the administration of a substance that he identified, cautiously, as likely arsenical in nature based on the specific condition of what he examined. He noted that his finding was not definitive, but that it was the most probable interpretation of the physical evidence available to him. He noted that arsenic was obtainable in rural communities as a component of various common products, and that its gradual administration over time would produce symptoms consistent with what Clement Prater's neighbors had described as a progressive stomach ailment. The circuit court proceedings opened in the spring of 1884. Both sisters were charged. The proceedings lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was, by the standards of what a modern court would require, thin, a physician's cautious finding, a community's accumulated observations, a child's death that could not be definitively connected to the defendants by any physical chain of evidence. The defense argued that the deaths were natural, that the community's suspicion was the product of grief and proximity, and the tendency of rural people to find cause where there was coincidence. It was not an unreasonable argument given what the prosecution was able to present. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Both sisters were convicted. The convictions rested primarily on Dr. Webb's finding regarding Clement Prater and on the testimony of George Fulton regarding his daughter, which the jury apparently found credible in a way that the defense's arguments could not entirely neutralize. Dorothy Holloway Prater was sentenced to life imprisonment. Lena Holloway received the same sentence. Both were transported to the West Virginia State Penitentiary at Moundsville. Dorothy Holloway Prater died in the penitentiary in 1901. She was 55 years old. The prison record notes her cause of death as cardiac failure. It notes that she was a model prisoner throughout her 17 years of incarceration and that she caused no difficulties for the institution. It notes, in the section reserved for final observations, that she maintained until her death that she was innocent of the charges against her and that the court had been deceived by the grief of her neighbors and the insufficient methods of a country physician. Lena Holloway died in the penitentiary in 1897. She was 48 years old. The prison record notes her cause of death as an illness of pulmonary origin. It notes one other thing that the Dorothy Holloway record does not. The attending physician on the ward, noting Lena's condition in the weeks before her death, recorded that she was often found smiling in circumstances that did not appear to warrant it. He recorded this as a symptom of her physical decline, a neurological effect, he suggested, of her illness. He did not offer another interpretation. The circuit preacher who had recorded the deaths in the Muddlety Creek Community Register, a man named Reverend Absalom Crane, wrote a private account of the Holloway case in his personal journal shortly after the conviction. The journal was donated to the West Virginia State Archives by his granddaughter in 1952. In this entry, Crane wrote that he had performed the funeral services for every person who died in that hollow during the years in question, and that he had observed the sisters at each service, and that what he had observed had troubled him from the beginning, and that he had not known what to do with the trouble. He wrote that he had told himself each time that what he was seeing in their faces was simply a different expression of grief than he was accustomed to, that people processed loss differently, and that it was not his place to judge the interior condition of a person's heart by the arrangement of their features. He wrote that he had been wrong to tell himself this. He wrote that the face, in his experience, does not lie as readily as the voice, and that he had known from the first funeral what the faces of Dorothy and Lena Holloway were saying, and that his failure to act on that knowledge was something he would carry to his own grave. He did not describe in that journal entry what he believed the faces were saying. He did not need to. He had been present at 4 funerals. He knew what he had seen today. The Muddlety Creek community in Nicholas County, West Virginia, is a small and quiet place. The hollow where the Holloway property stood has been through many hands in the century since the trial. No structure from that period remains. The community church where Reverend Crane recorded the deaths has been rebuilt twice and stands in a different location from its original site. There is nothing in the hollow that marks what happened there between 1878 and 1883. The Nicholas County Circuit Court record is in Summersville, in the courthouse archives, available to anyone who requests it. Very few people do. Here is the question this case will not let go of. How many people died in that hollow before Bess Fulton's father refused to be quiet about it? The official count is 4 confirmed and 1 probable. The community's private estimate, shared in the statements given to Sheriff Samples and recorded in his notes, suggested the sisters had been present at a greater number of deaths in the years before the inquiry began, deaths attributed at the time to the ordinary mortality of a hard place and a hard era. Some of those deaths had no surviving family members to question them afterward. Some of the families who remained had made their own decisions about what they knew and what they were willing to put in front of a sheriff. Were Dorothy and Lena Holloway women who found in the management of death a form of power that the world they lived in offered them no other access to? Or is there a version of this story in which the answer is darker and simpler than that, in which the smiles at the funerals were not about power at all but about something that has no better name than what Reverend Crane could not bring himself to write? Drop that in the comments, because I have been thinking about those faces for a long time, and I am still not settled on which explanation requires more courage to believe. If these are the cases that stay with you, the ones where the community saw and the community knew and the community still could not stop what was happening, subscribe and ring the bell. The hollows have more. They always do. The faces tell the truth, even when everything else is silent.